Hello, I'm Daniel Meyer, Artistic Director of the Lakeside Symphony Orchestra, coming to you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, virtually on this, the third edition of our LSO virtual series. And of course, this is all because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Otherwise, we would be performing concerts for you live in Hoover Auditorium and frankly, all over the campus with chamber music. So it's with a tinge of regret that I come to you this way, but I just wanted to make sure that we stay connected. And I thought today what we might talk about is what on earth do conductors do when they are standing on the podium? I mean, I remember when I first saw a conductor work with an orchestra, I was astonished, first of all, at the sound of the orchestra, and I was incredibly excited by it. But at the end of the day, I really had no idea what he was doing. And I just saw arms moving, and I saw hips swaying, and I saw faces, and I saw all sorts of communicative elements to what he was doing, but I really didn't completely understand what was going on. That was when I was rather young. Fast forward to when I was in college, and I was invited to conduct a piece of music that I had written for the college choir, and I got my first chance to conduct, and I was suddenly hit with the reality of what actually goes into becoming a conductor. And of course, as you learn, and as you learn more about the art of conducting, you realize what an incredibly complex endeavor it actually is. And it really capitalizes on the number of skills that you're able to amass over the course of your music appreciation and your music study. So I guess that brings us to the first point. What makes a conductor? How does anyone even feel qualified to stand up in front of his or her colleagues and wave arms and make music? Well, the first thing is that most conductors that I know of had studied one or two or more instruments. And that, of course, could include the piano, could also include an orchestral instrument. My background was piano, which I started studying from kindergarten, and violin, which I started studying from third grade. I also had some percussion experience and performed in some school bands as I was growing up. And then another element of my musical training, of course, was the voice and learning how to sing and how to apply your voice and use that as a musical instrument. And you'll find that most conductors that have the chance to stand on a podium in front of very fine musicians will have had a similar background. Now, I know of conductors that are percussionists, some are trumpet players, some are bassoonists, some are strictly pianists, some actually play piano while they're conducting the orchestra. There are any number of backgrounds, but most conductors first get study in an orchestral instrument. And if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you want to be able to lead a group of musicians, there should be some level of understanding and some level of expertise with a musical instrument, and understanding the discipline that goes into learning an instrument, the talent that you need to hone in learning an instrument, the sheer dedication it takes to practice and spend time honing an instrument. All of those are very important elements. And then, of course, learning how to make a musical phrase, how to play in tune, how to play with solid rhythm, how to perform with a consistent sense of pulse. If you're able to hone these elements yourself as a musician, then of course you'll be able to impart those things on an ensemble when you do get a chance to work with them. So number one really is becoming a good musician in and of yourself as a soloist, and then being able to transfer those skills. In fact, it's very rare. I think there may be only one or two schools in the United States that even offer conducting as an undergraduate degree. Most schools of conducting are graduate schools, and thereby require that their candidates take an undergraduate degree in an instrument or two. You'll also find some musicians who become conductors are also composers. And that's, of course, a wonderful and unique skill. And it certainly also is important in unlocking the score or unlocking the music that you're ultimately going to conduct. And that brings us to probably the second point of what it takes to be a conductor. And that is, you have to be able to study a musical score. Now, if you've ever seen a musical score, whether it's Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or Mahler's Second Symphony or a very complex piece by Xenakis, all musical scores are written in some sort of language that is understandable by a trained musician. And that is to say, the musical score includes every voice of every instrument that is played on the stage. So If it's a full symphony orchestra, that includes woodwinds like flutes and oboes, clarinets, and bassoons. And it includes brass instruments, of course, with horns and trumpets and trombones and tuba. A bevy of percussion could range from just bass drums, cymbals, and timpani. Could also include snare drums, xylophone, glockenspiel, triangle, any number of wonderful percussion instruments. There's certainly an unending list of various and fascinating instruments that can be used by the symphony orchestra. And then, of course, the string family, which is the largest family of the orchestra, which includes violins divided into groups of usually 1 and 2. So violin 1 and violin 2. They're all playing the same instrument. They're just playing different lines with that same instrument. And then you've got violas, which is still also played under the chin and is a little bit larger and therefore a little bit deeper than the violin. Then you have cellos, and then you have double basses. And so a musical score is laid out with the highest voices of each family grouped top to bottom. So starting with piccolo and flute, and then moving through the oboe, clarinet, and bassoons and contrabassoons. And so that constitutes a singular family, and you're able to read which instrument plays which part. And then you'll see the brass, you'll see the percussion, and you'll also see the strings, and they're all laid out on the same page. So if you can imagine, with maybe only 4 or 5 or as many as 8 measures per page, the conductor is flipping pages a lot faster, or a lot more frequently than, say, somebody who's sitting in the second violins. And that's because the second violins only have their specific part on the music stand. That means they only have that to worry about. And of course, they are required to master their individual part. And then they can use their ears and their musical intuition and their eyes to interact with their colleagues around them. And of course, there is a degree of responsibility for each musician on the orchestral stage to understand how her part fits in with the rest of the whole. So the conductor has all of those individual parts listed in order from highest to lowest on the score page. So that's why you can only fit so much information. If you're putting all of those notes on a single page, that means the conductor invariably is going to be turning pages a lot faster and a lot more frequently than somebody who's sitting in the orchestra. So that requires a degree of mastery and understanding. Another element that is a little bit tricky for conductors first starting out is learning about transposing instruments. Now, this is a bit of an oddity in the musical world, but essentially a transposing instrument is one that is fingered one way or played one way, but it actually sounds a different pitch. Now, why on earth does this happen? Well, the best way I can explain this is that instruments are made to utilize and maximize the beauty of sound for which they're created. So for instance, clarinets are made in different sizes to maximize and to sound as best as they can. It just turns out that the best sounding clarinets are pitched in B flat and A, and not necessarily in C. And it also goes for some other transposing instruments. Saxophones are invariably transposing instruments because the optimal size to make the optimal sound doesn't line up with the C major scale that you would play on a piano. So the idea is that the composer composes the notes he actually wants to hear, but he has to write them at a different level on the staff so that when the musician plays those notes, they come out the right way. Now, this sounds confusing. It is confusing, particularly at the beginning. And this is something that composers and conductors have to understand when they're reading a musical score, because middle C on a saxophone, or the C on the third space, does not necessarily register, in fact, doesn't sound as that C on the piano. So you have to have that understanding and knowledge of how these instruments transpose. Now, once you solve some of those clues, then you start to unpack the musical score. And that means that you're looking for similarities. You're looking for lines that look similar or might belong together. You might find that the oboes are paired in thirds. So maybe the first oboe has the melody line, and maybe the second oboe is playing a counterpart that's just a third below it to create some harmony. You may find that the first clarinet is playing exactly the same thing as the first violins. That's important to know. That's a color combination that the composer is asking for, but it's also a color combination that requires an understanding of how the clarinet transposes and where the violin lies and how difficult or how unusual that line might be for the violin. So you're getting into the weeds a little bit here with score analysis, but that's really the second aspect of understanding a score, is to being able to read the musical notes on that score and also understand what they mean and how they fit in with the other instruments of the orchestra. This takes a long time to master, and composers have a good go of it because they're really motivated. If they want their music to be played by an orchestra, they have to learn these transpositions rather early on in their training. And frankly, so do conductors. If they want to stand in front of a group of musicians and be able to listen to the music that they're playing and correct it if need be, they need to understand these basics of transposition. Of course, you also need to be a good musician and have good training. And that means you are able to take the notes or the symbols that are printed in the score page and be able to understand them and to be able to impart your wisdom about how they should be played. Gustav Mahler very famously was an expert conductor as well as a composer. So if you look at his musical scores, they're peppered with very specific instructions about articulation and accents and how smooth you should play a particular phrase, or when you should take a break, or when you should take a slight pause and start again. All those things are very clearly delineated and spelled out, and we have a lot of information about the history of how these were composed and how he would, after a first reading with an orchestra, go right back and make all of these changes and make sure that those get put into the musician's parts. So that makes his scores fascinating from a conducting standpoint, but it also makes it interesting because you get into the mind of how Gustav Mahler was, not only as a creator, but what he was as an interpreter. And you can understand the way that he conceived of music and how he conceived of phrasing in particular. These sorts of cues that you can learn the more that you're familiar with his music. If you take a score of, say, Johann Sebastian Bach, you may be lucky to get loud and soft and the notes, and that may be it. It may say nothing about where do you inflect, where do you add emphasis, where do you slur, where do you connect notes, where do you separate notes, where do you speed up, where do you slow down? All those questions that might be answered by a composer who uses the details to the degree of, say, a Gustav Mahler or a Pierre Boulez. You don't get that from Bach. You just don't get it. So you have to learn the styles of playing in that era. You have to read treatises. You have to understand and study very carefully the capabilities of the instruments in Bach's era. For instance, the bows that Bach used were strung very differently than the bows that we use in the modern day violin and cello and bass world. The strings were strung with catgut instead of synthetic or nylon with steel wound around it. So the sound world that you get, the oboes, the bassoons, they were all constructed differently in Bach's day. So you have to understand, know all these unusual or aspects of the instrument that are not like the modern instrument, so that you can really understand how the music was put together. So in some degree, score study requires being a bit of a musicologist. And that requires a lot of reading and a lot of extra study. And it's really a lifelong pursuit to try to get to the core or to really understand how to interpret a particular piece of music, particularly within the context in which it was written. One thing you'll find when you thumb through recordings of, say, Beethoven symphonies, you're going to find that there's a really wide variety of interpretive styles. Now, particularly because of the fact of the early period performance practice movement that came to fruition in the 60s and really came to flower in the 70s and 80s, and now is very much informing the way that we interpret the music of Beethoven and Haydn and Mozart and the Baroque, and even into the early Romantic, including Mendelssohn, and even there's some early music groups that have even recorded Bruckner symphonies. This is a stream that influences the way that we understand how this music was written. And it really behooves me to know what happened in that early performance practice movement so that I can apply the things that were learned and studied and experimented with in that era and apply it to what I do today as an interpreter. So that's yet another aspect of score study that goes into it. Now let's move away from score study for a little bit and let's get into the third aspect of what I wanted to talk about with conducting, and that is the absorption or the understanding or the mastery of a physical language to communicate what you want to do with the music. Now, what does that mean? Well, for some conductors, it could mean just using your hands. For some conductors, it involves using a baton. In my case, I generally use a baton, particularly if it's an orchestra of 25 players or more. If it's a very small group, I may just use my hands. If it's a choir, you'll find a lot of choral conductors eschew the baton, and they much prefer to use their hands because it's such an intimate and an expressive means of communicating. I happen to think that the baton is a wonderful instrument or wonderful tool for a conductor because it really focuses the information that you want to communicate into that tip of that long baton, and frankly makes yourself a little bit easier to see, particularly if you're conducting in a dark opera pit or you're on a very large stage where you're trying to coordinate the efforts of a tuba player who's really far away versus the concertmaster who's sitting right under your chin. So that's another tool in the toolkit that a conductor can use to help communicate. But in day one of conducting class, you're learning the basics. You're learning where to set your hands, how to stand, how to keep your neck still, how to keep from moving too much or just gesticulating with your body, and really focusing the information that you're trying to convey and you're trying to lead the orchestra with through that gestural language of the hands, the arms, and let's face it, probably the most important mode of communication, which is the eye, the eyes. You can really communicate an incredible amount using your eyes and using your facial expressions to elicit a particular mood or a particular way of making a phrase. This is something, again, that I think takes a lifetime to master. And there are some conductors that you'll find that are really particularly gifted at this. And I always admire, and I'm a big fan of the art of conducting, and I really love to study other conductors and watch them and watch their art. And gratefully, some of the great conductors, there's quite a bit of information, there's quite a bit of video footage from concerts or filmed concerts where conductors and orchestras thought it was important to capture the kind of music making that they could make with their maestros, with their music directors. And so I would like to delve into a little bit of that with you right now, and we can talk a little bit about style, and we can talk about how those earlier elements of mastering the score and of being a really capable musician influences then the decisions that you make on the podium and the way that you're able to communicate with your musicians through your gestures. So let's start with someone that I think all of us at least have some sort of knowledge or contact with, and that was the great Leonard Bernstein, the great American composer, conductor, pianist, teacher. I mean, there virtually wasn't anything that Bernstein couldn't master. He was an amazing composer and poet, a wordsmith, a brilliant soul who kind of lived 3 or 4 lifetimes in one. It was just an incredible human being. And it's really fun to watch someone who is so verbally adept have to keep silent and just really use his body and his soul and his eyes and his face to communicate his musical will after having absorbed the notes and the musical score of a piece as famous as the Tchaikovsky Fourth Symphony. So what I'd like to do now is play this clip for you. This is the very beginning of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony with Leonard Bernstein conducting the New York Philharmonic. It'd be interesting to note that I don't believe he was music director at this point. This was a kind of a reunion of sorts at a filmed concert live from Lincoln Center. And here we go. This is Leonard Bernstein. What I would like you to look at when you watch this particular clip is look at his face, look at his eyes, study his gesture, watch his body, and watch the degree to which he's engaged with the music. Is he moving a lot on the podium? Is he gesticulating a lot, or is he staying rather still? Is he being very forthright with his eyes, perhaps like an actor who's acting on a large stage or an outdoor stage? Or is he subdued and really holding his cards close to his chest? Look for those couple cues when you watch this, and then we'll talk a little bit about his conducting after you watch this clip. This is Leonard Bernstein with the New York Philharmonic conducting the very beginning of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony. An incredible clip of Leonard Bernstein, a wonderful document of a great maestro with an orchestra that he knew very, very well. And of course, he was at one point the music director of the New York Philharmonic. And he was conducting a kind of a signature piece for that orchestra and for him. And that was Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, the very beginning of it. I chose that clip for you to watch because it really showed off quite a bit of what made Bernstein such a unique conductor. First of which, he couldn't help but bring his personality to the podium. So his enthusiasm for music, his joy for the love of making music, his belief that together he and his orchestra could make anything happen musically. I think that's all communicated in the way that he stands, in his energy, the way that he's able to move his body, the way that he's able to, I really love the way that he moves his center of gravity a lot. He's able to kind of move across the entire podium. Now he's on a box, he's on a podium, so he doesn't have a whole free range to dance around the stage, but I think he would if he actually could. He's just got that kind of energy leaping out of his skin. But I also think that he was completely adept at harnessing that incredible musical energy and that knowledge of the score into the way that he conducted. Of course, he uses a baton. But one thing that I think you probably might have also noticed is that he does a lot of what we call hitching his beat. And that means that he's not just giving a simple gesture, but he's also articulating a bit whether he wants to show, this is a little bit technical, but he's trying to show subdivision or the beats beneath the beat. If you know anything about a half note, you know that it's made up of two quarter notes, and each of those quarter notes are made up of two eighth notes. And one thing that you always want to do with your ensemble is make sure that everybody plays together and understands those underlying beats behind the larger beats. So that's one way that you can kind of communicate with each other, is by silently thinking of the subdivisions or the smaller notes that exist behind the larger notes. So I think when he's hitching his beat or adding a double beat or a triple beat, depending on the situation, to each larger beat, what he's really trying to communicate there is the fact that there are these smaller beats that lurk or live beneath the larger beats, and that those smaller beats are what give the music its propulsion and give it its inner life and give it its, frankly, its ability to wane and wax, to grow, to get smaller, to explode, to recede, to gradually grow over a particular span of time, or to dissipate. All of these different abilities to control the phrasing or to control the way that the music ebbs and flows can be done, or he actually does, through these smaller subdivisions or hitches that he adds to his beat. I think that's really fascinating. It's phenomenal how he does it. A lot of conductors, he was such a magnetic personality, and he taught so many conductors in his generation that you can actually see that in some of his proteges and some of his pupils. You can see them doing these subdivisions because you understand that they too are trying to master this art that Bernstein so beautifully was able to master, which is take a technique that is very grounded and understands very well where he needs to be for the musicians, but also is able to show some smaller refinements and more details by the way that he slightly subdivides the beat or hitches it as he performs. All right, now for something completely different, let's move on to the artistry of the great German conductor, or I believe maybe he was Austrian, forgive me. But he certainly conducted both Austrian and German orchestras. He was, of course, best known as the music director of the Berlin Philharmonic for many, many years. And of course, he conducted the Vienna Philharmonic and made many famous recordings with them. That aside, Karajan is a very different character. And of course, he was often compared with Leonard Bernstein in his day because they were kind of two of the giants of the music world and the orchestral world, particularly in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s in the digital era when orchestras were starting to conduct CDs. So they could take all the repertoire that they had conducted earlier in their careers and now transfer that skill and that knowledge to the digital era. And you could even hear with more clarity and even more impressively hear the details of all these different instruments and what they can do and how they fit into the texture of the orchestra. Anyway, you've got Karajan, who is a very different type of conductor. The same thing I want you to notice, you don't have to look for anything necessarily very technical, but definitely look at his face, look at the way that he moves his gestures, look at the way that he conducts, and think about some points that are similar to Bernstein, but also that are different. Let's take a look at this. This is a performance with the Berlin Philharmonic, and they are performing the beginning of Beethoven's famous Ninth Symphony. This is Carillon, Berlin Philharmonic, filmed in the Berlin Philharmonie with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. That was Herbert von Karajan conducting the Berlin Philharmonic on the stage at the Berlin Philharmonie in the beginning of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, his famous Ode to Joy Symphony. Some really striking differences, aren't there, between him and Bernstein? It's really quite fascinating to see. Of course, the thing that everybody notices right off the bat with Karajan is the fact that he often conducts with his eyes closed. Now, a lot of it has been written about Karajan and him conducting with his eyes closed. Let's agree that he wouldn't be able to do that necessarily with an orchestra that didn't already work with him for many, many years, or didn't already trust that the way that he works and the way that he conducts is going to elicit a response, particularly with his eyes closed. So that's one thing you'll know, is that he really reserves that for musicians that know him very, very well, and it's been very, very well coached. The playing of that Philharmonic is really astonishing, the Berlin Philharmonic under Karajan. I mean, it's so executed with such a degree of perfection and of unanimity. It's very clear that he's drilled into them the way that he wants them to play the music. There's very little left to question based on what he's doing with this gestural. One thing that really strikes me about Karajan, and that I really admire about the way that he conducts, is that he's really able to create the sensation of resistance in his gesture. Now, if you take your arms and you just start to move them around, if you want your arm to go slowly, you really have to envision something working against your arm so that you can create that illusion that there's more resistance than just the gravity and the air pressure, the air density in the room in which you're conducting. Karajan was a master of that. He was really able to show through his gesture this incredible ability to fill in or give texture to every beat that he conducts when he wants to. Of course, he can also be very vigorous and really get a strong beat if he wants it, and you saw that in that clip. But you also saw, even in some vigorous music, he's really showing a resistant motion between beats, or between the change of direction of his beats. And that, I think, helps to create or reinforce this idea of a sound world that Karajan wants to create with his orchestra. He wants to create this very specific, lush, warm, strong, meaty, fleshy kind of musical sound from his orchestra. And he's reinforcing that idea through the way that he's communicating with his gesture. So rather than very sharp, crisp motion between each beat, he gives that first beat, but then he drags his hand until he gives the next beat. And that dragging is what really signals to the musicians, unconsciously, I think, in most regards, that he wants each sound, each note that they play, to have a lot of texture and be very full. And this is something that he, of course, honed over many, many years in work with the Berlin Philharmonic in particular. And I chose this clip because here's a conductor at the height of his powers, conducting a piece that he's conducted hundreds of times, if not nearly 1,000, the Beethoven Ninth Symphony, with an orchestra that understands his way of making music intimately and almost so simpatico that he almost doesn't need to talk. But of course, this is all communicated in the gesture, and it makes it really for a fascinating counterpoint to Bernstein, who is much more effusive and much more direct and much more eye-opening, and really trying to connect and make cues with his orchestra and really connecting with his eyes, where you've got Karajan, who is kind of the sorcerer who keeps his eyes closed and really draws the music into himself. And you'll also notice he was a very good director in terms of the camera angles for this concert. I'm sure you noticed how closely the musician looked in terms of being stacked up next to him. So he made sure that every shot gave this impression that the orchestra was surrounding him, and really they were kind of one organism working together at the same time. Let's move ahead to a protege of Karajan, and this is the great former music director of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, the Japanese conductor Seiji Ozawa. Ozawa had still has a phenomenal conducting technique that I think involves his whole body. And I think you'll find some really interesting corollaries or some similarities to the way that Karajan worked. But I think you'll also see some things that are unique to Seiji. So let's take a look. This is Seiji Ozawa with his own orchestra that he helped found in Japan, made up of largely Japanese musicians, some of the finest musicians on the planet, in addition to some of the other fine musicians that he worked with in the other great orchestras that he had the pleasure of conducting over his career. This is a recording of the Beethoven Ekmont Overture. And take a look at some of the things that makes Ozawa similar to Karajan, but also distinguishes himself, makes a unique figure in the conducting world. This is Seiji Ozawa with Beethoven's Ekmont Overture. What an incredible conducting technique, one that I never tire of watching. There's so much to learn from him. And he also taught at Tanglewood. So young conductors in his generation looked up to him and studied with him and tried to absorb some of the aspects of his music making. I guess I should mention there is an element of apprenticeship too in the conducting world, because you don't actually get to conduct until you stand up in front of other musicians. So a large part of learning how to conduct is watching others do it well. So when you get a chance to watch someone of Seiji Ozawa's caliber, you try to absorb every little bit and every little technique that he uses. You probably noticed that he holds the baton a little bit differently than the other conductors. Their baton tends to extend a little bit more forward. He tends to hold it a little bit more horizontally. And it's almost as if he's using it as a separate instrument, almost as if he's bowing an imaginary cello or something like that with it. But it's very clear. There can be no question where the beat lies with him. I love the physicality of his conducting. I love the fact that he gets his whole body into it. I think if you think about it, he's kind of the perfect amalgamation of Karajan and Bernstein, both of whom he spent time with and studied under and admired. So you have this electricity and this connection with the orchestra that Bernstein certainly had. You've got this kind of Zen master focus that you see in Karajan. But then Ozawa, I think, has this beautiful gestural language that's unique to him, that is fluid, that involves the whole body, that is balletic, and that very beautifully and elegantly communicates what he intends to do with the music. And of course, you've also noticed, I think actually all three of these excerpts, you'll also notice that the conductor didn't use a musical score, which means that they have committed the bulk of the information that's in the score to their memory, so that they don't have to keep looking down or referencing the musical score. They can go straight into the orchestra and communicate that energy and that intention directly to their musicians. It's pretty incredible, and I really admire what they're able to do with their gestural language. Ozawa's a bit of a dancer. I mentioned that he's balletic, but by and large, I think every gesture that he does is directed at either eliciting a specific kind of articulation, a specific kind of sound, or a certain kind of energy. And if you think about it literally, conducting means something that can transfer energy from one body to another. And I really conceive of conducting doing that, because if you know exactly what you want to do with the score, you've absorbed it so well and you know it so well, and you know how to help the musicians and when to cue them, and you know what you want to do in terms of steering the music and giving it its ebb and its flow and giving it its life, then a supreme technique can do that so well with the musicians. And you can actually spend you can communicate a lot of information without even saying a single word. And I think that's the hallmark, I think, of a really great conductor. It doesn't mean that these conductors didn't talk in rehearsals. Believe me, they did. Bernstein used to give 15-minute homilies or sermons, if you will, in some rehearsals. Karajan, and someone like Karajan, he knew his orchestra so well, and they knew him so well, that he often only had to say a few words, make a few corrections in terms of balance, and then they knew what to do with his stick technique, what they call stick technique. I think maybe we'll wrap it up with those three conductors, because it's they all certainly lived and existed in the same milieu. Of course, Karajan and Bernstein were more or less contemporaries. Ozawa was just the next generation, and Ozawa, of course, studied under those two conductors. But of course, they were all active in the music scene and making incredible music with the world's great orchestras at roughly the same era. And it was really a kind of a glory era in terms of the art of conducting. I can't think of three that share similarities in terms of their complete command of the musical score and their ability to communicate, but also their incredible abilities to elicit what they need with this elegance or beauty in a very different kind of style. Although they all kind of existed in the same realm in the same era, they all had very different ways of creating a conductor's technique that brought forth their own individual skills as a musician and the mastery of a particular instrument, whether it's Bernstein or Karajan as incredible pianists. Ozawa, I believe, was a string player. And then, of course, their ability to master the musical score. Bernstein, of course, very famously was a composer, so he was able to sit down at a piano and be able to play the contents of any complex score, whether it was a tone poem of Strauss or whether it was one of his own works. And then you've got this just incredible ability to put it all together in a gestural language, that is an ability to move your baton, your eyes, your body, to communicate with the orchestra, to elicit a unique and a very energetically and focused performance of a great piece of music. I never tire of studying conductors. I hope you never do either. I'm really looking forward to getting back with the musicians of the Lakeside Symphony Orchestra. Let's hope that it's as soon as next summer. I'm grateful to all my colleagues who have weathered this particular storm right now, and particularly those who were able to create some musical performances for you live there in Lakeside. And of course, we cannot wait to get back with the LSO and make more great music. So we'll look forward to that day. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction, this little look into the world of conducting and studying three of the greats in Leonard Bernstein, Herbert von Karajan, and Seiji Ozawa, all three of which are readily available on YouTube if you're interested in looking more at those specific performances, or if you just like to dabble in some of the other great pieces that they conducted. This is Daniel Meyer, Artistic Director of the Lakeside Symphony, saying goodbye for now, and thank you so much for tuning in.